My goodness, everyone got quiet all of a sudden. Well, good evening and welcome to our program tonight. I'm Don Carlton, and I have to get my glasses out or I won't be able to see what I'm talking about. And I'm the director of the university's Dolph Briscoe Center for American History. The Briscoe Center is delighted to join with the LBJ Library in co-sponsoring tonight's program featuring David and Julie Eisenhower's fascinating book, Going Home to Glory, a memoir of life with Dwight D. Eisenhower from 1961 to 1969. It's a fabulous book. When LBJ director Mark Updegrove asked me if I would be interested in co-sponsoring tonight's program, I jumped at the chance. We always enjoy partnering with our friends here at the LBJ Library, but our topic tonight, President Dwight Eisenhower, is an added attraction for us. The Briscoe Center's divisions include the Sam Rayburn Museum, located up in the North Texas town of Bonham, and the center is the repository for Sam Rayburn's papers. Sam Rayburn served as the Democratic Party's minority leader in the House of Representatives during the first 2 years of Eisenhower's first term, and he served as Speaker of the House for the remainder of Eisenhower's presidency from January 1955 until January 1961. Although Rayburn and Eisenhower had more than their share of legislative disagreements, basically over domestic policy, they nevertheless had a very warm personal friendship. Eisenhower was born in Denison, Texas, which was in Rayburn's congressional district. In private meetings at the White House, Rayburn often joked with President Eisenhower about Rayburn being Eisenhower's congressman. Mr. Sam, who was 8 years older than Eisenhower, also called Eisenhower Captain when they had private meetings. Now, that was a habit he picked up from Cactus Jack Garner, who referred to Franklin Roosevelt as Captain every time they were in private meetings. More significantly, however, Rayburn and Eisenhower both had middle-of-the-road political philosophies and a strict sense of national duty, and both understood the necessity of legislative compromise. Often, after the Congress had adjourned for the day, Rayburn and Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson would slip out of the Capitol and be driven to the White House, where, out of sight of the news media, they would enter the secluded southwest entrance and be escorted to the president's family's quarters on the second floor. There, over drinks, the two Democratic leaders and President Eisenhower would discuss current issues, and they would work out informal bipartisan strategies for furthering public policy. Sam Rayburn, Lyndon Johnson, and Dwight Eisenhower were political partisans from two different parties, but they always put country first and party second. In November 1961, 10 months after the end of Eisenhower's presidency, Sam Rayburn died at his home in Texas. Among the mourners at Mr. Sam's funeral at the Little Baptist Church in Bonham was Dwight David Eisenhower, shown here in this famous photograph with Presidents Truman and Kennedy and the future President Lyndon Johnson. Serving as interviewer and moderator for our program tonight is the director of the LBJ Library and Museum, my good friend Mark Updegrove. Mark needs no introduction to this audience, but I do want to say something about his work that is particularly relevant to this program. Mark, who is one of the leading presidential historians in this country, is the author of the book Second Acts: Presidential Lives and Legacies After the White House, which, as the title implies, examines the post-presidential experiences of all the presidents who served after Franklin Roosevelt, concluding with Bill Clinton. One of my favorite chapters in that book is the one that Mark wrote about the years that Dwight Eisenhower spent after the White House. So Mark will be interviewing our special guests, David and Julie Eisenhower. David Eisenhower is the grandson of President Dwight Eisenhower, and his father, John Eisenhower, is a prominent military historian. David is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Eisenhower at War, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History in 1986. He currently serves as the director of the Institute for Public Service at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and he is a senior research fellow at the Annenberg School for Communication. David Eisenhower has served on numerous not-for-profit boards and committees, including the Advisory Committee on Presidential Libraries. A graduate of Amherst College, David Eisenhower earned his law degree from the George Washington University Law School in 1976. Our other special guest is David Eisenhower's co-author, Julie Nixon Eisenhower, who just happens to be David Eisenhower's wife. She's also the second daughter of President Richard Nixon. Julie is also a best-selling author, editor, and a recognized public speaker on such subjects as the presidency, women in politics, and life in the White House. She began her career as a writer for and then assistant managing editor of the Saturday Evening Post. Julie Eisenhower's books include Pat Nixon, The Untold Story, as well as Special People, and Julie Eisenhower's Cookbook for Children. Julie Eisenhower has served on several nonprofit boards and serves as a trustee of the Richard Nixon Foundation, the Nixon Center, and the Eisenhower Medical Center. After graduating from Smith College, she earned a Master of Arts from Catholic University of America. When David's book, Eisenhower at War, and Julie's book, Pat Nixon, The Untold Story, were published in 1986, it was the first time a husband and wife each had a book appearing simultaneously on the New York Times nonfiction bestsellers list. Please join me in welcoming Mark Updegrove and David and Julie Eisenhower.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Well, Julie and David, welcome. We are delighted to have you here tonight. Actually, I should say welcome back, because you were among the very special guests of this library when we opened our doors on May 22nd, 1971. And you accompanied, Julie, your mother and father here. Your father was president at the time. I wonder if you have any memories of that day.
I remember it like yesterday.
Go ahead.
Linda's here, Lucy's here, Harry Middleton, I think, is here. Harry, I can't see you through the lights, but I'm looking for you. There he is, still teaching at University of Texas.
That's great.
That was a great day. And I can remember the large crowds, and we saw a picture of it in a holding room just as we were getting ready to come in. The precise date was about May 22.
May 22.
1971. And this is 8 weeks after I've graduated from Naval OCS School. I've just graduated from Dam Neck Surface Warfare School, and I'm getting ready to ship out.
Your hair had grown in.
It's grown back, yes.
It was grown back to they'd shaved it.
This is my last leave, I think, before going overseas. I remember the day very well.
I think one of the things that's perhaps not as well known is that the Johnsons and Nixons were good friends, and we saw President and Mrs. Johnson quite often during the presidency, and Linda and Chuck were living in Washington, and my parents used to have the church services, and so Linda and Chuck were often there, and I just have a very warm feeling for the entire Johnson family, and really we're here tonight because of Linda and Lucy. They are very giving and caring people, and I'm just proud they're my friends.
Well, we appreciate that. We We're delighted to have you back. You're friends of the Johnsons and of this institution. You've been very good to this library, and we thank you for that. Behind us is a picture of your first meeting in 1957.
This is the first. That's where we met.
That's where you met at the inauguration of President Dwight Eisenhower and Vice President Richard Nixon. And it began a relationship that seems to have lasted. Can you talk about how your relationship evolved from that time?
Well, we really just met as kids and saw each other, I think, twice.
Yeah.
And then we happened to get together again when we went off to college because Mamie Eisenhower was a very romantic person. And she was just insisted that David look me up when she found out.
I wasn't going to do it either.
No.
I was at Amherst, she was at Smith, 7 miles away, and I think there had actually been a news story that we were going to be going to schools somewhat together. I didn't want to put her on the spot. Finally, Mamie did prevail on me to do this, so I went over, liked her tremendously, went back and called on her about 6 weeks later, and had one of these experiences that suggests kind of the obstacles that are posed to a relationship like this. Smith had a proctor system, and I can remember presenting myself to the proctor, a student, you know, with this horn-rimmed glasses and long straight hair. She's a bio major or something, and I walked up to her and I said, "I'm David Eisenhower, and I would like to see Julie Nixon." She gives me this long look and says, "Well, my name's Harry Truman." I persisted, and it worked.
Now, when your grandmother wanted you to meet, did she have an eye toward courtship?
No doubt about it. From the beginning. Oh, yes.
Well, I had seen Mamie at a funeral a month before I went off to Smith, and I think I'd also seen the Eisenhowers out at the Palm Desert recently. So
yeah, we were
anyway, she was a fun person.
We were secretly engaged.
Charm bracelets.
We were secretly
skirts.
engaged within a year of meeting in college.
It was a whirlwind courtship.
Whirlwind, and my grandmother was behind it all the way. She was in on the secret, and she was the one that provided the ring and everything. So it was
Now,
should I have admitted that?
Yeah, no, that's good.
Okay.
When you did get married, your grandfather-in-law gave you a copy of that picture and he signed it. What is the caption of that?
He said, for Julie Nixon, who even then seems unknowingly to have acquired an admirer. It was cute.
But I'm not sure the audience can see. You have a shiner in that picture.
Yes, I had a black eye from a sledding accident. Washington had a huge snowstorm. I lost control of my sled, went into a tree, and I think Dave was interested in the black eye.
Lucy and Linda would know exactly where this picture was taken. This is the north lawn of the White House, where the presidential reviewing stand is during the inaugural. I can remember the inaugural of 1957 very vividly. And it's really the beginning of my, I would say, my engagement with the Eisenhower presidency, my grandfather's presidency, and all the people who were involved in it. This was an inauguration staged after Eisenhower's landslide re-election in 1956, but which coincided with one of the most dangerous intervals in American and international history. This was the confluence of the Hungarian Rebellion of 1956 and the Soviet invasion of Hungary, which coincides with the British, French, and Israeli invasion of Egypt and the Suez Affair of 1956. And so as a result, one thing that I remember vividly about 1957, you can take this as kind of a start point. Rocket after rocket after rocket,
Right.
military unit after another, we put our arsenal on display in what I guess kind of like a May Day parade.
Just like the Soviets did.
Like
Yeah,
the Soviets did, to remind the world that the United States was standing tall and that we were standing by our friends, and it was a spectacular inaugural, one of its kind, I think. And every one of them has had a different meaning, but that's kind of where we start, right there.
Well, you get married, you know that your father is about to become president, and when you get married, your father tries to talk you into a White House wedding, and you opt against that.
He actually just offered. He just said, "Would you like to wait?" But we just didn't have any interest in doing that because we just wanted to have one last private event before the presidency began. So.
Well, I think it was something that sustained us throughout 1968. We made a pact, and again, Linda and Lucy would, I think, appreciate this. And that was we were going into an election year. And I think that Richard Nixon had lost in 1960, and he had lost for governorship in 1962. I think that all of us thought that this was an uphill fight. Right. And we resolved in January of 1968 that win or lose, we were going to have a great party in December. And as the election unfolded, I think we really clung to that. That there is something that we can really look forward to right around the bend, and that became important to us. And so I think we just sort of kept our own word to ourselves, isn't that it?
Right.
That we were going to celebrate it a certain sort of way, and
right.
The election worked out. But it was a wonderful party before the Nixon presidency began, as it turned out.
And the only thing, David, that your grandfather objected to in the Union when you got married was your hair. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, he offered me. He was worried. I think he felt that appearance is sort of destiny. And this is the late 60s, where hairstyles are getting kind of wild. So I think he disapproved. I was pretty conventional, but he disapproved of most of the haircuts that I got, and I had sort of a standing $5, $10 offer as a sort of incentive to keep it short. And I saw so much of them in the period that I never allowed anything to get out of hand. So.
President Nixon, in his memoir, I believe, says it was $100.
Yeah.
And he also says that yours was the shortest hair among your groomsmen, and he further says that your grandfather didn't pay up.
No, he didn't.
It wasn't short enough.
It wasn't short enough.
This was a negotiation. He was looking for a buzz, I think. And
let's talk about your grandfather for a moment. This is a bona fide American hero who happened to be the President of the United States, and he's your grandfather. What was it like to grow up with Dwight Eisenhower in your life?
Well, I think I can try to convey this in Going Home to Glory. And I think that Julie and, again, Linda and Lucy, the question is, when do you become aware of the fact that you're in the presence of something very unusual? Well, I think you have to recognize two things. First of all, you have to be around situations that are interesting, and second, you have to have some sort of contrast, some sort of frame of reference. I would say by the time I was 7 and going to school in Fort Belvoir, I was an Army brat, and going to school on the post, or going to school in Alexandria, and by day, going to a regular school with classmates and so forth, and then by night and over weekends, realizing that I was walking into this amazing phenomenon, the presidency. Plane flights to all kinds of exotic places, and vacations in the high Rockies and in Newport, and all of the people surrounding the President of the United States, and all of the anticipation surrounding figures and the crowds. That contrast with going to school, I'd say 7 or 8, I became aware of I was very aware. Now, my first memory of the world, in fact, I have a handful, but these are summer of 1951. I'm really dating myself, but I can I have pictures in my mind of Dwight Eisenhower boarding an airplane. This is in France, dressed in his 5-star military uniform. I can remember the Trianon Palace Hotel, where we spent the summer of 1951. He was commander of the NATO alliance at that moment, and I think even then I had an intimation that he was unusual. Julie probably has similar stories, and the Johnson girls, of course, grew up as young children in Washington.
I think my memory is that I don't know how old I was, 6 or 7, and my father and I were reading together, and we were looking at a picture book of the presidents. My father was then vice president, and we got to Abraham Lincoln, and under his portrait it said, America's first Republican president. And I said to my father, was George Washington a Democrat? I was so upset. Very upsetting.
David, you have chronicled your grandfather's life, most notably, as Don mentioned, in Eisenhower War, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in 1986. What do you find most remarkable about your grandfather?
Well, Mark, we have something in common, and that is you've written a book, Second Act, which chronicles post-presidencies, which I think is an important In the post-presidency that we cover in Going Home to Glory, I think this is where character is most accessible. It stands out.
Yeah.
A president is surrounded by aides, a wartime commander is surrounded by aides. To get to know my grandfather in that capacity, I had to study his life. And so I was drawn to the World War II subject. Solzhenitsyn says that in every life, there is an event that is decisive for one's personal convictions and one's future. There is a point in Dwight Eisenhower's life, the fall of 1943, where everything that happens to him to that point is interesting. But nothing specifically prepared him for the responsibilities that he would undertake between November 1943 and May of 1945. By contrast, what happened to him in those 18 months made it predictable and inevitable that he'd be President of the United States. And so I got to know that Eisenhower through the historical record. The word "I" does not appear in Eisenhower at War. I did not, I believe in an introductory statement, which my editor made me write, I explained my methodology and I explained why I was doing this book, and so I probably used the vertical pronoun there, but I am simply, I don't exist in that book, and this is a dimension of his life that I had to learn through history. By contrast, a former president, and a number of people in this room have known former presidents and worked with them. This is a person who you have access to. And so the person, and these are very unusual people, the person who is driven into national prominence becomes knowable, accessible to you. I didn't, and I learned so much about that man by being around him in the twilight of his life. The Eisenhower of Abilene, Kansas, the Ike of, and born in Denison, so forth. In fact, he did not admit to being born in Denison. When he registered at West Point in the summer of 1911, he listed Tyler, Texas as his birthplace rather than Denison because I believe it's better to be from Tyler, is that right? And switched his first and second names on the entry form. In fact, he became Dwight David when he registered at West Point rather than David Dwight. And omitted some details as well. Omitted to tell West Point that he had played professional baseball in the probably the Kansas Central League, 1909-1910, which was confirmed to me. Baseball PR man, famous man, Red Patterson, accompanied Dwight Eisenhower to a ball game in 1947. He was then a hero, and he was in uniform, and confronted the general with rumors that he had concealed a past in professional baseball. He said, that there were rumors throughout organized baseball that he'd played in Kansas under the alias of Wilson. He said, but our records show there were two Wilsons in the league. Which one were you? And he said, the one that could hit.
You both collaborated on Going Home to Glory. And you talked about how post-presidential chapters are very revealing. I can't agree more. And I think they were particularly reflective of Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon. But talk about how the difficulty in the transition for him from the presidency into private life.
Which is why you would take the subject up too. We have, Dwight Eisenhower is actually setting a precedent in this book. In 1951, we ratified the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, which term limited the president. I don't think Americans fully appreciate how extraordinary that law is. What we are doing with the 22nd Amendment is that we are telling charismatic, extraordinarily able individuals who in practically any country in the world might rule for their entire natural lifetimes. We are forcing them to step down after a term or two, and we are not only forcing them to step down and relinquish power, we're obliging them to kind of like it. This is enacted. Democrats teased Republicans for a long time. The Republicans drove this amendment in 1951, and then suddenly they elect a president who might have won a third term. But Dwight Eisenhower leaves Washington. This is where the story opens. For most Americans looking back on January 20th, 1961, the inauguration that day is the opening of a new chapter, brand new. 1 million people are in Washington waiting to bring in the new administration of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And where Julie and I begin this chronicle is with the other story. and that's the president who's going home. And going home to a new life, and one which is going to reward him with a certain amount of satisfactions. But I think that I'm proud of the individual in these pages because he carries this role off, I think, with a great deal of dignity. One of the things that it chronicles, and one of the reasons why we're so delighted to be here at the Johnson Library, is this extraordinary relationship between Dwight Eisenhower and Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah.
This is an historic relationship, and I can just raise the surface of it in this book. The documents behind the story that I tell are very extensive. This is a tale in a highly divided partisan era that we are in now, that it is possible for people to reach across the party divide and to cooperate meaningfully on issues. I think that Lyndon Johnson regarded Dwight Eisenhower as a resource when he was in office, as Dwight Eisenhower regarded Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson a resource when he was in the Senate. So it narrates a friendship. But Mark, what I think I like about it and why it drew you to the same subject, presidents, Julie's father said something interesting once. I just happened to be there. There was a president unnamed trying to organize another gathering of former presidents. And he was not eager to do this. And he just made a sort of throwaway comment, you know, we all represent something different. I don't know how often we ought to get together, but we all represent something different. And I think that taking that comment and extending it just slightly, presidents, because of our 22nd Amendment, never entirely cease being president. They actually fulfill a kind of role. Lyndon Johnson represents a kind of story, rising Texas, and the dilemma of the South and the West in civil rights. He's the great lawgiver in civil rights. This is a story which is unique from Richard Nixon, who is the middle class after World War II finding its place in the sun, and Dwight Eisenhower, the man from central Kansas, who makes a historic and eternal record, not in central Kansas, but in London and in Paris, symbolic of this great journey of Americans. Every president represents something different, and each president, as they leave office, continue in some sense to be president.
Right.
And I think that's why the story comes on.
Julie, President Eisenhower goes back to Gettysburg, not as President Eisenhower, but as General Eisenhower.
Yes.
Why was that?
He made it be known immediately that he would take his title of General of the Army, and because although the presidency was a great honor, you know, the highest honor that America can bestow on an individual, and he honored the presidency, the defining time of his life, as Dave said earlier, was World War II, and the bond that I think he felt with the men that he led. So when you would go up to the Eisenhower farm and look out over those beautiful green rolling hills, there on the putting green was a little 5-star flag. And, you know, he took his stationery, said, you know, it had 5 stars in gold, the stationery, instead of the presidential seal, which he could have done. So
presidents, you know, actually what that gesture did, and it was early in 1961, in fact, his request to be restored to rank puzzled President Kennedy. But if you think about it, and we thought about it when we were putting the book together, Dwight Eisenhower is making a statement here, and it is consistent with everything that was happening in 1960 and 61. You have a generational shift. There is no doubt about it in 1961.
Sure.
Richard Nixon, who was the old man in the 1960 race, was younger than Obama was in 2008. This was a generational shift. And the wartime generation is making way for a new group in America. And so what Eisenhower is saying by restoration of rank is that to understand his presidency and why he was there and what he accomplished between 1953 and 61, it's a period of reconstruction, like the reconstruction that followed the American Civil War. In a 20th century frame, he's a very underestimated 19th century, one of the greatest men of the 19th century is Grant. who carried forward the Reconstruction after the American Civil War. This is what the Eisenhower presidency is in many ways. And then in January of '61, he was going to be succeeded either by a Republican or a Democrat, both under 50, both restless and looking for a way to sort of branch out. And this becomes the theme of Going Home to Glory, because what happens in Going Home to Glory is that the wisdom of the war generation, what they took for granted, is constantly challenged. And what Eisenhower has to understand in dealing with Lyndon Johnson and also Richard Nixon particularly, and John Kennedy, is that he can offer support, he can offer advice, so forth, but in the final analysis, the generation in power is charting the course for the nation and perhaps responding to imperatives that he doesn't understand completely.
Right.
And I think we make that very clear. Towards late '67 and early '68, the world begins to confuse Dwight Eisenhower a little bit, but then he understands that this will work out. America is a land of ingenuity. One of the great things about the presidential office in this country, we require people to really work hard to get there. And so we are led by very exceptional people. And we have been able to rely on presidents to find solutions to great dilemmas that America's faced.
You write in Going Home to Glory about a conversation that you have with your grandmother about your grandfather, and you ask if she ever really knew him. And she replies, "I'm not sure anyone did." What is at the root of that comment, David?
Well, my father noted this about Franklin Roosevelt, and it was a sort of an admiring comment he made about Franklin Roosevelt. Here we are at the Lyndon Johnson Library. This is, by the way, Julie Gutowski is here. She's a former student. I send students to the Johnson Library every semester. I know this institution. I know what a great one it is, and the great story told here. Presidents are sort of mysterious in a lot of ways, and I think that this is more obvious in certain libraries than it might be in others. What my father said with admiration is that Franklin Roosevelt was completely inscrutable. Franklin Roosevelt is a mystery in his own papers. I would say that that is true of a number of presidents. They are people who...
They're very complex.
They're complex. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Julie. You want to take
No,
that?
I agree with you. I think they're very complex, and they're driven and they're extraordinary. They
Would your mother have said
lot
the
of
same
layers.
thing about your father? I'm sorry.
I think he I think he was more knowable.
Your father?
Yeah.
Come
no.
on.
No, I mean.
No way.
No?
Okay.
I thought,
No,
he was
wait a
such a
minute.
great family man. I mean, the way I knew him, I don't know.
No, let me
Oh,
put
you
it
mean
this
like
way.
politically maybe he wasn't as knowable. I don't know, but as family-wise.
No,
Yeah.
I'll just
He was
say,
very,
I'm,
never spanked, and I wouldn't do that, honey. It
I
was the
think that
harshest
these
thing he ever
people
said.
have, people with that kind of drive develop a sense of what they're going to be rather early in life. And the thing that makes me smile a little bit listening to Julie is that Julie wrote this wonderful book called Pat Nixon, The Untold Story. And one of the collections that she breaks in that book is an amazing cache of letters that Richard Nixon wrote Pat Nixon from the South Pacific
Right.
in 43, 44, and 45. If he isn't telling her in these letters that he's going to go out and become president, I don't know what he's telling her. This is, it's there to see. As the story goes, Bill Clinton's classmates were saving his letters and little things that he wrote at the age of 15 and 16. He wasn't captain of the football team, he wasn't this, but he exuded an extraordinary sense of himself. I'm sure Linda and Lucy have stories or something that relatives would narrate about Lyndon Johnson, a man of extraordinary drive. My grandfather. My father tells a story in 1938 or 9. They were living in Manila. And Dwight Eisenhower, he's working for MacArthur, and Douglas MacArthur. And my dad confronted my grandfather with the suggestion that my grandfather was wasting his time. Why are you wasting your time working for Douglas MacArthur as an assistant, liaising with President Quezon's government and so forth, and you have one offer after another from large shipping concerns and businesses that are based in Manila and so forth to go into business. Why are you wasting your time? And his reply was, I believe a war is going to break out in 24 to 36 months. And when it does, I will lead the theater. He's a colonel. These are, I don't want to be mystical about this, I'm just saying they're unusual people. And I think that there is, therefore, an element of them which is unknowable.
History is full of references to the tensions between Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, but you were there and saw that relationship up close. How would you characterize the relationship between the two men?
I think the answer is that it's amazing they got along as well as they did.
That's the point.
Because you're taking two presidential personalities bumping along together. In other words, we have Dwight Eisenhower who's the president, and then you have Richard Nixon who's going to be president. And for these two people who both have, ideas and agendas, and for them to get along as well as they did, I think it developed into a warm friendship. But I think that the energy and the fact that my father represented something different from Eisenhower as well. He represented a newer generation. He represented a Pacific outlook. And
Eisenhower had his own clash with MacArthur. Same thing, and you can draw an analogy. When you see pictures of Douglas MacArthur and Dwight Eisenhower bent over a desk, going over some document relating to the Filipino 1st Division in 1938, you are looking at the man who commanded U.S. forces in the Pacific and the man who commanded U.S. forces in Europe right there. Now, this is a colonel, or a major, and a general who is in effect retired. You would have no idea that these people are the figures that they are. And about then, MacArthur began to get an idea, working with Eisenhower, that he wasn't going to get along with him. My grandfather was sent on a trip to the United States in 1938 to try to equip the Filipino 1st Division and returned to Manila believing that he had served his boss well. This is, I think, when we're talking Eisenhower and Nixon, people say, well, was Nixon devoted to Eisenhower as a subordinate? And did Eisenhower value Nixon's services as a subordinate?
Right.
Well, Ike ran off to the United States to do work. Finally, the general's come up with an assignment. It's been a year, so forth. I've been bored to tears and so forth. He's writing in his diary and so forth. And when he returns to Manila, literally his key does not fit in the lock. His successor has been appointed in his absence. And Eisenhower confides in his diary saying, I will not give the general the satisfaction of knowing that I'm being fired. What General Douglas MacArthur is simultaneously telling the War Department is that this is the finest officer that I've encountered in the United States Army, and the moment war breaks out in Europe, he should be detailed to high command immediately. MacArthur's firing him and recommending him for high command. And I think what that means is MacArthur understood he did not have a staff officer on his hands. Eisenhower was, as much as he wanted to serve MacArthur, he was never going to be a staff officer. And so this thing degenerates into a series of misunderstandings. MacArthur is finally driven to call Eisenhower, quote, the best clerk I ever had. Eisenhower is driven to call MacArthur what, quote, the greatest instructor of dramatics that I ever studied under. So forth. But, they went their separate ways. What we personally saw, what we narrate in Going Home to Glory, is that my grandfather was a dying man in 68 and 69. And in that period, I think he wanted to make it very clear that he had always had a fondness for his vice president. There were always going to be stories about how they related and so on, but I think that was rooted in temperament and the kinds of people that they were, and I think he wanted all of us to know that there was genuine affection there, and I think there was.
Julie, your father ran for the presidency in 1960 and was defeated. He ran for the governorship of California in 1962 and was defeated. Went through some wilderness years.
Yes.
And then ran for the presidency in 1968. Jumped right back into the arena and against all odds got the nomination and ultimately the presidency. What drove him to seek office again after those two earlier defeats, which many thought was his ultimate demise in political life?
Well, really it was his vision of how we needed to deal with the rest of the world. And in '67, he wrote in Foreign Affairs an article called Asia After Vietnam, and that's when he talked about China can't be left in angry isolation, and we had to take steps to bring China into the family of nations. And I think that his passion for foreign affairs and the fact that this wilderness period you referred to is when I was in high school, and my father was constantly traveling. Sometimes we would go with him, meeting with as many world leaders who would see him, and calling on all of the relationships that he had developed when Eisenhower sent him to 53 countries around the world as vice president on these goodwill trips. And that was his passion. He felt he could serve the country, and that's why he wanted to run. But it's interesting to watch this primary because it was very uncertain my father could win the nomination in '68, so he had to develop a strategy, and his strategy was to enter every primary and win it, and he did. But it was in '68, the first primary was New Hampshire. He won 70%. So, I mean, these are huge numbers when you think of what Romney and Gingrich and others are pulling in. Yeah. And then he went on to Nebraska and I mean, we were there the whole step of the way.
Wyoming,
Indiana, Wyoming, right.
Nebraska, yes, Wyoming.
California?
Actually,
Oregon. Anyway, so it was an uphill battle, but the way he did it was just to go out and campaign and win the primaries, and then he got the nomination. Yeah. If he hadn't won the primaries, he wouldn't have been nominated because he wasn't the choice of the Republican Party.
This is the era before the
leaders.
Both Republicans and Democrats adopted the binding primaries or awarding delegates through primaries. Primaries were primarily in that period for demonstration, to demonstrate popular following and to influence delegate selection in states, which is that is a way we chose presidents. Then we choose presidents differently today. We have a record of those presidents. We have a record of the presidents that we've had recently. I'm not sure it makes a whole lot of difference. I think that was a good method of choosing presidents.
It's interesting to note that when he ran, the favorite for the nomination was George Romney, who was
at the very beginning, and then Rockefeller
governor.
And then Reagan came in. It was really, there were a lot of formidable people in the party who wanted that nomination.
Yeah. What was the relationship between?
I love one of my favorite parts of the Going Home to Glory is one of my father's aides was a congressman named Bob Ellsworth, and he was sent out by my dad to basically not schmooze Governor Reagan, but go out and keep giving him good reports about the Nixon campaign. It's just going great, etc. So he'd go out and call on Reagan, and it was just great because he kept trying to influence what was going on with Eisenhower and Reagan. And finally, what was your grandfather's
Well, Reagan was always sending people in to see Eisenhower to try to convince the general that Reagan was not a right-winger.
Right. That was the word, the right winger, right? But it was a funny relationship.
Yeah, it was a funny relationship. In fact, many of Dwight Eisenhower's friends in Palm Springs, Palm Desert, became members of the so-called governor's cabinet in 1970. Reagan won in 1966 and served 2 terms as governor. And then these are Holmes Tuttle, Justin Dart, people like this. These are prime movers behind the Reagan campaigns of '76 and '80.
Right. Yeah. Julie mentioned your father's views on China, and that, of course, opening China to the West in 1972 with his visit to Beijing was one of the triumphs of his administration. Would he be surprised at China's rise in the world, and would he be pleased with where they are on the world stage?
I don't think he'd be surprised because when his last book it was actually published posthumously because he died a month before it came out. It was called Beyond Peace, and the title of the book is from his last conversation with Mao Zedong in 1976, when Mao said, President Nixon, is peace the only goal that America wants? I mean, is that it? Is that the goal? And my father said, no, we have to go beyond peace. You know, we have to build a more just world. We have to, et cetera. So that was the title of the book. And he predicted in that book that China would be a powerhouse, and of course it is today.
Yeah.
But I think that the important thing is that, you know, one bond I feel with the Johnson family is that Vietnam was such a torturous time for our country, and I admired Lyndon Johnson and, you know, his courage and his leadership. He was trying to find a way to end that war, and a way to, you know, at the end he was in negotiations, et cetera. And then I remember that I wrote in my diary the day before the election, I said, you know, if Daddy's elected president, I just fear that the nightmare of trying to resolve the war in Vietnam, it's going to be almost, and that's what these two presidencies have in common.
Right.
But I'll add
is
something
to
else
having
too, and this
to,
is something else they have in common, and this is across
the
a
war.
partisan divide, and that is a very interesting letter, and Harry is undoubtedly familiar with this. I spoke to Walt Rostow many times when I came here to research about this. He was Lyndon Johnson's NSC advisor, so forth. There's a very interesting letter from Johnson to, I believe, Walter Lippmann, or one of the very famous journalists of the day. It may have been Drew Pearson, but I think it's either Pearson or Lippmann, talking about his differences with Fulbright and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And what Johnson explains in this letter is that he believed, unlike many of his critics in the Senate, that the American interest ran equally strong towards Asia as it did towards Europe. In other words, the reason he was waging the Vietnam War was to demonstrate America's commitment and interest to Asia. It was that interest and commitment demonstrated by two presidents that opened China. There is no way in the world China facing 45 rocket divisions deployed in Manchuria by the Soviets, who were about to muscle them back into the so-called socialist Commonwealth, is going to take a chance on relations with a nation that does not value Asia. And so persisting.
and keep its commitments.
As Lyndon Johnson refused to do, as he said at Johns Hopkins, that he would never withdraw under the cloak of a meaningless agreement, and so forth. As difficult as those times were, he did bequeath a chance for the United States to achieve larger aims in that conflict. And one of them was persuading Asia and Asian governments that the United States truly cared about that region. And that is a fundamental building block to our relationship with China. And what Julie's dad made very clear at that time, and I was very interested in this as a teenager and somebody just turning 20, the only thing I knew about China were these people waving red books and so forth, these mass demonstrations, Mao swimming the Yangtze, remember, in record-breaking time and so forth, this zaniness coming out of China. And he came back from several trips. This is very early in our courtship. And he would regale us at night with his stories in Hong Kong as an attorney and his consultations with people in the Far East about what an extraordinary area of the world this is and what he expected these nations to become. He made that very clear in this period, and I thought it was interesting because I'd never heard it before. Yeah. And I think that is his gift, or that's his contribution. Our presidents do contribute things. Many of them encounter difficulties, but they contribute. And Nixon's great vision of Asia mattering to America in the way Europe mattered to us between 1941 and 45. And seeing that arena as the center of development and so forth in decades to come was a tremendous contribution, which is remembered and acknowledged throughout China today.
Right. Julie mentioned Vietnam, and Linda and Lucy often talk about the pain of watching their father go through Vietnam in the White House. And you've written about the pain that you experienced watching your father go through Watergate. And your father wrote in his memoir Julie and David lived on the front lines of Watergate, and they suffered its brutal assaults every bit as much as I did. What was that experience like for you during the latter years of your father's tenure in the White House?
Well, of course, it was difficult because it was terrible for the nation, and no, it just wasn't something terrible for the family, but the whole Watergate saga, it wasn't good for the presidency, and so that was very difficult. And I think that I wouldn't want to put words in Linda and Lucy's mouths, but I would think that it must have been very difficult at the end of their dad's presidency, but with the 500,000 young men fighting in Vietnam, and really just this almost seamless endless war. And and when your husband, like Lucy's husband, was overseas, Chuck served, the sacrifices that a lot of people are making, and you just never want to let people down. So I think that's what makes it difficult when you go through something
It's
like
very hard,
Watergate.
I think, for a president going through that period, not in some way to let the American people down. I won't say America was ungovernable in that period, because we did come through. You know, the interesting thing about Vietnam is, just think about this for a second. We have the fall of Saigon in 1975, and we do not have an intervening event anywhere involving the United States for the next 10 years. And what happens? Soviet Union collapses. Not one intervening event. We did things right in that period. Vietnam, what does Vietnam mean? Does it mean that America lost a war, or does it mean that the United States is such a dynamic country that they sustained an effort on behalf of a minority in Southeast Asia, 8,000 miles away, mounting a logistical effort that no other country in the world could even conceive of? What lesson did countries around the world derive observing the United States in this period? I think what they saw was an extraordinary effort. And I think that is, strangely, William Westmoreland was interviewed about this. And he says, he was asked about 12 years ago, the commander of Vietnam. We saw him at a funeral not long ago. I guess Bob Hope, 2003. And he was asked about, what do you make of the fact that you commanded American forces in Vietnam, and we had this, the terrible setback in Southeast Asia, and Soviet Union has collapsed around the globe, and communism is in retreat everywhere, and the West has won. What do you make of that? And he says, well, I guess it's the luck of the Yankees or something. I just don't know. But I think the answer is that this was a very difficult period. It was a transition period in America. I think that's palpable in the speeches of presidents in that period, that we really are passing through a transition. America's assuming great responsibilities without clear-cut enemies and challenges. They are ambiguous responsibilities that we were assuming. And so I think that we had difficulties. I think it was impossible anywhere from 61, I would say, all the way through 80. For a presidency not in some sense to disappoint America.
Julie, anyone who lived through the Nixon administration has very deep impressions of your father. What do you think is the most popular misconception about your father?
I haven't really thought about that. I tend to think of the positive. I kind of retired from that whole thing. What I mean is, I'm so proud of his record.
Sure.
That's what has to be focused on. Not just the foreign policy, but the Environmental Protection Agency, the desegregation of the southern schools. That was really, Tom Wicker, the New York Times columnist, said that's his greatest achievement. When he took office, 68% of black children in the South were in all black schools. When he left office, 8%. And the way he did it, and it showed his leadership, was that he quietly engaged Southern officials. Instead of saying, this is a shame and a scandal and the South is bad and we've got to change this, he got the Southern officials to be on advisory committees, They were doing all kinds of things to make sure this happened, and there was a partnership. And I really think that this made the South the great region of the country it is today, because how could the South be a great region if they had parts of their population that were not treated equally? You have to get rid of that in order to move forward. And so now today the South is probably the most dynamic section of our country.
Right.
So I think there are many things that we could talk about with the Nixon presidency. You better not get me started.
No.
Okay. So.
David, there's a memorial that's being planned now in Washington to your grandfather. It's adjacent to the mall. There's a great deal of controversy around that.
Adjacent to the Johnson Education.
And between that and the Air and
Right,
Space
exactly.
Museum in
Yeah.
Washington. But there's a great deal of controversy around that. Can you talk about the current plans for the memorial and why your family
Well, I've just stepped
opposes
down
them?
as a commissioner, in fact, stepped down. And that was not because that I had, what transpired between me and the commission is between me and the commission, but I stepped down because I have a conflict of interest. I have become chairman of the Eisenhower Presidential Foundation. And this memorial is going to raise funds nationally, and we're trying to raise funds. And so it's a gentle conflict. It's not, and also we've entered a phase where the Eisenhower Memorial is actually being designed. And the fact that it is being designed has brought out all kinds of differences of opinion. And that doesn't surprise me. If you think about how you would do a national memorial to Dwight Eisenhower, I would think that I could come up with 1,000 ideas, I think. The way the commission did it is they retained probably the most famous architect in the world, Frank Gehry, and they solicited designs from him, and that is a concept, and the concept is out there, and the architectural community in Washington is responding to that, and I'm not surprised at all that there are other designs out there, and I do not doubt that there will be modifications in the existing design and that it'll work out ultimately.
Right. We talked about misconceptions about your father. One, you alluded to one, Julie, which is that he was a lot more moderate than most people think he was. And in fact,
actually, he's called the last liberal president. I don't know. So certainly, I don't know. He was in the mode of the progressive presidents.
I think both President Eisenhower and President Nixon were moderate, certainly by today's standards. The GOP has evolved considerably since that time. I wonder, what do you think your grandfather, David, and your father, Julie, would think of the current crop of GOP candidates for the presidency? That's what you call a loaded question, I guess.
No, I mean, but aren't they amazing in the sense that, think of the pressure they're under with the debates. They're really, I mean, I think that it shows their quality, that these people can get out there, the ones who are still standing, get out there and answer complicated questions week after week. We've never put candidates through this before.
It's grueling.
It's grueling, and we've had a few
There's
presidential
been a winnowing process, but
so,
I've got to say, even the people who have dropped out of this race are impressive. What?
Right.
I think they are.
No, I mean, no, some, yes. No, some of them, yes. I mean, not all of them. No, they all are well-intentioned. I really don't, here's what no, seriously, I really believe this. I really think politicians are to be admired for the most part, because you don't run unless you really believe in things and you're willing to put something on the line, and you've got to admire that.
And I'll say
And it
something.
takes courage.
Sure.
And I'll say something. I think we're all picking up on partisan divisions, and we're picking up on a, I would say, kind of tone or a frantic quality and so forth, at least in the early phases of the campaign. One thing that is different about politics today than some years ago, and I think it's something that we've got to think about, is that our parties are very evenly balanced. One reason that Dwight Eisenhower and Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower and all of these people were able to collaborate in a way is because you had an undisputed majority party. in the 1950s and 1960s. Now, you've got an undisputed majority party, and therefore there's an incentive for the minority party to find common ground, and the majority was so unwieldy that often the leader of the majority party had to reach out for minority support, as Lyndon Johnson did in passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He needed, I think he got 3/4.
Yes.
The Republican House supported a bill that divided the Democratic caucus 50-50 because of the unwieldy size of the national majority. I think that the incentives right now in our national politics, we're going through a phase here where the incentives are not to reach across the aisle, but to mobilize your own people, bring your own people to the polls. We don't have an answer for that, except that I think the American people, over the last number of elections, have really not rendered a clear-cut decision in the way so many of our elections were decided back then. If you look at Eisenhower in 52, this is a decisive victory. 56 is a landslide. 60 is very narrow. Lyndon Johnson, 64, huge landslide. 68, narrow. 72, huge landslide. In other words, we had decisive elections by comparison with the ones that we've had since 84, or 88, I guess. 92 was close. 96, relatively close. 2000, the closest of them all. 2004, very close for an incumbent president. 2008, an apparent majority, but immediately taken back by the off-year Republican gains. Americans just haven't quite resolved the competing claims yet. That's what I think is going to happen this year.
Both your grandfather and your father became elder statesmen in their winter years. What counsel would they give members of the GOP today, given the state of the party?
Well, be prepared to govern. I think this is, this is the thing. It's one thing to run for office on a certain basis. It's the other. Something happens when you assume responsibility for the direction of this great country. I think we've all experienced this. I feel the presence of the Johnson White House in this building. We've been here many times, and Lucy and Linda are here. Julie, same thing. I think we've all had an experience where it's actually occurred to us walking into the White House that people are, that a great nation is really relying on the judgment of the administration and the people who are assembling in Washington to do this. And I think in the final analysis, that's the direction I think this campaign is going to take. I've noticed in the debates that in substance, the Republicans are talking about many more interesting ideas are on the table now than were there 5 to 6 months ago. This process has brought forth ideas. I think it's brought forth a much more constructive approach to these ideas. We're discussing things in detail now in our political press that we were not even, that were simply ideological matters 5 or 6 months ago. So I think that this election is rounding into form. I think we're going to have a great debate.
But I also think the American people really want to see bipartisanship, more bipartisanship. Presidents trying to put people of the other party perhaps in positions of power as it has happened in the past, or whatever, working together as the Democrats and Republicans did in the 50s and 60s more.
Right.
I think sure we want to stand on our principles, but it's a little disturbing when the Republican Party or the Democrats go just down party lines. No one's allowed to even veer off. I don't know, it's almost like right-think.
Right.
So I just think that people, that most people I talk to, and I must not be talking to the ones who want just the party, just everyone to fall into line, just want to get the sense that we have a lot of difficult problems out there and we have to solve them together. So let's have some more creative ways to do it.
That suggests a position of moderation as well. I wonder, do you two have a favorite candidate in this race?
No, not really, no. No, again, I really mean it when I say I'm impressed by the debate, by the knowledge of these candidates in these debates.
Yeah.
And I'm just wishing them well, and
Yes. Well, every election that we've ever had has always been the most important to date. But I think that there is a special feeling about this election. And I think we're all riveted. We're discussing, we're finding ways to discuss the future direction of the country in a very interesting way. And I think that what we're looking for is some kind of verdict that will allow us to understand which era we're living in now. I think that when that happens, and that did happen during the New Deal, it accounts for much of our statesmanship in that period. I think that we understood the direction that our country was going in. We had a sense for the relationship between the federal government and the private sector, and for America's responsibilities in the world. We had a consensus in this period, and the consensus is something that grew out of a great national party, the Democratic Party, winning in 32 or 33 for better or for worse. And I think what's happened is that consensus has broken down. We're going to forge one when we need it now, and so I think we'll forge it.
Right. I'm going to invite my friend Don Carlin back to the stage to ask some of the questions that the audience wrote out earlier this evening. Don?
Well, we have some questions from the audience, and to sort of connect with the concluding comments, we have one question that asks if, David, you would care to speculate about how your grandfather, President Eisenhower, what he would think about the vast sums of money in politics today.
I think that would be, it's difficult. We haven't resolved that issue. Actually, political contributions were not really very regulated in that era, as far as I know. I think that the idea that we have to somehow regulate and control expenditures in presidential campaigns, awareness of that developed during the Eisenhower years. I think it's difficult to try to imagine what an individual 40, 50 years ago would try to make of the circumstances that he's in now. I know that, in fact, I'll paraphrase a famous, or I would say paraphrase a sort of maxim that I sort of live by. And that is, history is never a guide to the future. But history gives us confidence in the future. I don't think that what Dwight Eisenhower may have thought or done or said is in any way binding on America today. But I think the fact that his leadership generation overcame the challenges of their time should give us confidence that we can overcome the challenges of our time. We are still the free nation that we were 50 years ago. We have an open process. Ideas contend in this country, and they all get a fair hearing, and we can all vote. And so we're going to work it out.
Very good. Perhaps one of the most famous speeches that your grandfather ever made as president was his farewell address, warning the American people about the growing power of the military-industrial complex. How does that speech look to you from your perspective today, over the years? Do you think he was misunderstood? Do you think that he didn't get it right? Has it played out? How has it played out?
Well, I think he's misunderstood. I think a lot of people thought that he was suddenly challenging the direction of national government and so forth in a basic way. In fact, what he was doing, this is the beauty of presidential libraries, by the way. I send students to the Johnson Library to study Lyndon Johnson's speeches and to study how they are crafted and put together. The Eisenhower farewell tells, and I can summarize this very quickly, but it tells a very, very interesting story about the genesis of that idea. That is a speech that underwent about 40 drafts. This was one of the best, most intricately planned speeches ever delivered by a president, and one of the greatest. And the first 13 or 14 drafts, I think, it's fair to say, and I saw these drafts in the Eisenhower Library, reflect the disappointment that the Eisenhower White House felt about losing the narrow election of 1960. And so it's sort of kind of criticism of the incoming administration or staking out positions that will give the Republicans hope and keep them alive as an opposition force. Somebody gets to the president and more or less says, you can't do that. Your job is to make your successor's job easier, not harder. So the whole effort kind of palpably in the drafts becomes something else. People begin to sort of take back and qualify this paragraph and that paragraph. And then finally, the entire focus of the Eisenhower farewell shifts. No longer looking forward, but now reflecting back on 50 years of service to the United States, addressing the great riddle that faced the leadership of that time. And that is, how can the world grow as fast as we have since 1890? How can we develop as rapidly economically as we have since 1890? How can we reconcile this matchless technological progress that we have made with the horrors of the 20th century, with the Depression, with World War I, with World War II? Is there something in contemporary life that places our political processes beyond our control? Are we losing the ability to govern ourselves and to guide our countries down the right path? This is a question throughout the 1930s. Europe went politically insane in the 1930s. How do you account for this? And I think his answer was the answer that we see today. And that is, there is no way of trying to instruct Americans 25 or 30 years from now what policies they should adopt or how big a Pentagon ought to be. The main thing is that American democracy will always rely on its alert citizenry. That is, people who care about national politics, take a part in it, join in our national dialogue and our debate. I would say the internet is making that possible. I think there's a degree of participation in American politics now, which is the highest I've seen, at least over the last 20 years. Perhaps higher earlier, but I think that was it was a timeless lesson derived from the experience of that leadership generation. And I don't think it necessarily applies to anything, but it does mean never forget in our government and our great institutions, and I think he meant this is a military industrial complex. This is a governmental non-governmental complex. In the final analysis, American citizens must never be diverted from the idea that these institutions serve us. Ultimately, they are accountable to us.
Call to engage.
They answer to the ideals that spring from the beliefs of the American people, and they're accountable to us. I think that was his point.
Well, we have time for one more question, and it's for both of you. It's for the two of you that we got from the audience here, and I want to go to that. And it says, do you have plans to write another book together? And tell us a little bit about what you're doing now.
We are going to write another book together.
Yep. We've got several, including one I promised Harry some years ago. We've been working on a book on the year 1968, which is a phenomenal book. That book not only has a working title, not only has an outline, but it also exists in about 1,300 pages in draft.
But anyway, in other words, we weren't. In other words,
you get the point. That's why I'm letting her.
That's why I'm co-editor or whatever.
Co-editor,
and
right.
helper. But,
censor at the moment.
No. But we enjoyed working together. It was really fun. We had a lot of laughs.
Yes. We had a lot of laughs, and
we want to thank you for your hospitality.
Thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for bringing us to the Lyndon Johnson Library. I tell my students every semester, and we have a program that sends people to libraries.
This is a lively place.
I am grateful to the staff here at the Lyndon Johnson Library. I think this is as great a research experience as people can have in the United States. This is a terrific institution. We feel close to it because we feel close to this era and the people who are part of it, and it has been a genuine pleasure to be received here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.